Caleb glanced up as the server approached, intending to ask for more water, but his gaze froze midair. Standing before him was Evelyn, his ex-wife. Her silhouette was unmistakable, her pregnancy undeniable. His chest tightened, a cascade of emotions flooding through him: shock, regret, and an ever-growing sense of unease. Yet, what he was about to uncover would shatter everything he thought he knew. This story will take turns you won't see coming. Let's go back to that fateful moment and begin unraveling it from the start. The golden glow of the city lights reflected on the sleek windows of the limousine as it pulled up to the Elmwood Grill, the city's newest and most opulent restaurant. Caleb Anderson adjusted his cufflinks, the soft gleam of his platinum watch catching the light inside the vehicle. Beside him, Olivia sat poised, her sequin dress shimmering with every subtle movement of her hand. She was everything the evening required: elegant, radiant, and exuding the aura of wealth Caleb had always pursued. "Do you think they have fungi fusion?" Olivia asked, her voice light but tinged with eager anticipation. "I've been craving it all week." Caleb smiled and nodded, his eyes glinting with confidence. "If they don't, I'll make sure they prepare it. Tonight is for celebrating. Nothing is impossible." The restaurant was a masterpiece of modern design, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the skyline. A host greeted them with a warm smile and led them to a table draped in pristine white linen. The air was rich with sophistication, every detail meticulously curated to exude exclusivity. Olivia leaned in, her eyes sparkling as she took in their surroundings. "This place is incredible. You always know how to pick the right spot." Caleb gave a slight nod, allowing himself a moment of quiet pride. Tonight wasn't just about the launch of his latest venture. It was a reminder to himself and everyone else that he was at the pinnacle of success, a place where achievements were celebrated in the perfect company and setting. As they browsed the menu, Caleb's gaze wandered, landing on a server approaching their table. At first, he barely registered her, a staff member in a standard black uniform navigating through the glamorous patrons. But something about her stride drew his attention. As she came closer, his breath caught. Evelyn. Her once familiar hair was now tied back in a simple ponytail, and the black blouse and apron she wore were a far cry from the elegant dresses she used to don. Yet her face, framed by the soft lines he had once cherished, brought every memory flooding back. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes hinting at long days and sleepless nights. But there was something else about her, a glow he couldn't immediately place. It wasn't until she was a few steps away that he realized she was pregnant. Caleb's chest tightened as a wave of emotions hit him: shock, guilt, and an unnamable ache. The woman who had once been his whole world was now standing before him, carrying a life he hadn't known existed. "What would you like to drink this evening?" Evelyn asked, her voice calm and professional. Olivia, oblivious to the rising tension between them, flashed a bright smile. "I'll have a glass of your finest Chardonnay." Caleb struggled to find his voice, his mind racing to process the moment. Finally, he managed to utter, "sparkling water." Evelyn nodded, her expression betraying nothing as she jotted down the order. For a fleeting second, her eyes met his. He thought he glimpsed something, a flicker of resentment, a hint of sorrow, before she turned away. "I'll be right back," she said, retreating into the flow of the dining room. Caleb's eyes followed her, his appetite evaporating. Her voice lingered in his mind, softer now, like an echo from another time. Late-night conversations, whispered dreams, and escalating arguments all came rushing back. He had convinced himself their divorce was inevitable, that they were heading in opposite directions. But now, seeing her pregnant, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something profoundly important. Olivia's voice broke through his reverie. "Caleb, Earth to Caleb." He blinked, realizing she was watching him with a puzzled expression. "Sorry, what did you say?" "I asked if you're okay. You've been staring off into space since we got here." She tilted her head, her gaze tinged with concern. "Is something wrong?" "No," Caleb replied too quickly, forcing a strained smile. "Just thinking about work. It's been a long week." Olivia narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing him, but eventually let it go, turning her attention back to the menu in her hands. Caleb, however, couldn't shake the flood of images rushing through his mind. Evelyn, smiling at him across their old dining table in the tiny kitchen they once shared. Evelyn, laughing uncontrollably as they danced in the rain on their honeymoon. And Evelyn, tears streaming down her face the night they admitted they could no longer stay together. When Evelyn returned with their drinks, she placed them on the table with practiced ease, every movement precise, as if she had done it thousands of times. "Are you ready to order?" she asked. Olivia made her choice quickly, her voice poised yet decisive. Caleb, on the other hand, hesitated, his gaze drifting toward Evelyn. It was as if he were searching for a sign, a clue, or anything to anchor him in the surreal moment. At last he ordered, his voice quieter than usual. Evelyn jotted it down briskly, her eyes never meeting his. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but tinged with curiosity. "You seem familiar. Have we met somewhere before?" For the first time that evening, Evelyn paused. She glanced briefly at Caleb, her eyes holding an unspoken question, before shaking her head. "I don't think so. I've only been working here for a few months." Caleb felt his throat tighten. The thought of Evelyn, the woman who had once spearheaded global marketing campaigns, now waiting tables, was difficult to reconcile. Yet, despite everything, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity, her head held high. As Evelyn walked away, Olivia turned to him, her brows furrowed. "Is it just me, or does something feel off?" Caleb let out a dry, hollow laugh. "You're imagining things. Let's focus on our evening, shall we?" But even as he said it, he knew the words rang hollow. His thoughts kept drifting back to Evelyn, the child she was carrying, the exhaustion etched in her features, and the unspoken stories behind her composed exterior. He couldn't stop wondering, how had she ended up here? And why, after all these years, did seeing her again feel like an uninvited yet desperately desired second chance? Dinner continued, but Caleb barely registered the conversation. Olivia spoke about their upcoming trip to the Maldives and an art exhibition she wanted to visit for their penthouse, but his attention remained elsewhere. Evelyn moved quietly between tables, her smile polite but distant. The image of Evelyn standing in their old apartment, saying she couldn't do it anymore, that his work would always come first, kept replaying in his mind. The evening concluded with Olivia's favorite dessert, creme brulee. But as they left the restaurant, the celebratory spirit Caleb had started the night with was replaced by an unsettling emptiness. Stepping into the cool night air, Olivia looped her arm through his and looked up at him with a bright smile. "Everything was perfect. Thank you, Caleb." He nodded absent-mindedly, his gaze drifting back to the restaurant's illuminated entrance. Somewhere inside, Evelyn was still working, unaware of the storm she had stirred within him. As the car pulled away, Caleb leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the passing city lights. The life he had built, so solid, so unshakable, now showed its first cracks. And in those cracks, he saw Evelyn. She was weary but resilient, pregnant yet strong, a stark reminder of all he once had, and perhaps all he had lost. The interplay of light and shadow on the car window blurred into indistinct streaks. Caleb sat silently, his fingers tapping a distracted rhythm on the armrest. Beside him, Olivia scrolled through her phone, humming softly to herself. The atmosphere in the car was heavy, a far cry from the jubilance that had marked the start of the evening. "You're awfully quiet," Olivia remarked suddenly, breaking the silence. She looked up from her phone, her gaze fixed on him. "Is something on your mind? You've seemed distracted since dinner." Caught off guard, Caleb hesitated. "Nothing, really. I'm probably just tired. It's been a long week." Olivia didn't look entirely convinced, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer. "Well, try to relax. We're heading to the Maldives soon. You need the break after everything you've accomplished." Caleb forced a smile and nodded, but his thoughts remained in the restaurant, with Evelyn. Her face, her presence, and her pregnancy churned in his mind like an unstoppable storm. Caleb hadn't always been the man he was now. There was a time when ambition wasn't the centerpiece of his existence. Late nights at the office and early morning calls hadn't defined him then. Evelyn had been with him through those early, uncertain years when he was far from the CEO of Anderson Industries. Back then, they dreamed of a future without limits. They had met at a small marketing firm where Evelyn had been a rising star. Her creativity and natural charisma lit up every room she entered. Caleb had been captivated immediately by her passion, her laughter, the way she turned even the dullest meetings into dynamic exchanges. Their connection was undeniable, and it wasn't long before they became inseparable. At first, everything seemed so easy. They were true partners, building a life together with shared goals. Evelyn wholeheartedly supported Caleb's ambitions, even as his work began to consume more of his time. She believed in him, in the vision he was pursuing, and Caleb promised her that every sacrifice they made would be worth it. But as Anderson Industries grew, so did the distance between them. Caleb threw himself into his work with relentless determination, convinced that success would make up for everything. The late nights, the missed dinners, the vacations that never happened. Meanwhile, Evelyn began yearning for something different. She spoke of a life with meaning that money couldn't buy. She wanted stability, connection, a family. Caleb still remembered the night it all came to a head. They were sitting in their apartment, the skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Evelyn, her voice steady but her eyes brimming with tears, told him she couldn't continue living like this. "I don't need the penthouse, the trips, or the endless dinner parties," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need you." "But Caleb, you're not here anymore." "Not really." He had tried to argue, to explain that everything he was doing was for them. But Evelyn had only shaken her head, her expression filled with a sorrow he didn't know how to comfort. A week later, she left. Caleb had told himself it was for the best. They wanted different things, and it was better to let her go than to hold her back. But now, sitting in the car with Olivia beside him and Evelyn's face etched vividly in his mind, he couldn't help questioning the story he'd told himself. Was it really for the best? Or had he been too consumed by his ambition to fight for the woman he loved? The car pulled to a stop in front of Olivia's building, breaking Caleb's train of thought. She turned to him, her bright smile tinged with expectation. "Are you coming up?" Caleb hesitated, then shook his head. "I've got a few things I need to finish tonight." "Rain check?" Olivia's smile faltered for a moment, but she nodded and leaned in to kiss his cheek. "Don't work too hard. You deserve to. Enjoy your success, you know." He waited until she disappeared through the building's doors before telling the driver to take him back to his penthouse. The silence in the car felt heavy, and his thoughts refused to stray far from Evelyn. Her tired eyes, her pregnant belly, and all the unanswered questions. Who was the father of her child? Was she happy? Was she okay? The questions lingered, gnawing at him all the way home. The next morning, Caleb sat in his office, a sleek, minimalist space perched on the top floor of the city. He stared at the report on his desk, the lines of text blurring before his eyes. For the first time in years, he couldn't focus. Caleb's mind kept drifting back to Evelyn, the way she had looked at him the previous night, calm, professional, but distant. It was as if she had built a wall between them, and Caleb knew he couldn't blame her for it. Olivia called him around noon, her voice cheerful as she talked about their upcoming trip. Caleb responded in kind, mirroring her tone, but his heart wasn't in it. Olivia noticed. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern. "You sound distracted." "I'm fine," Caleb replied too quickly, his words carrying an edge of defensiveness. "Just a lot on my plate right now." A pause lingered before Olivia's voice returned, this time more curious. "Does this have anything to do with last night? With the waitress? You seemed off after she came to the table." Caleb's grip tightened on his phone. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Olivia said lightly, though there was a probing quality in her tone. "It's just, you went quiet all of a sudden. And she seemed familiar. Do you know her?" Caleb hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "She's someone I used to know, a long time ago." Olivia didn't press further, But Caleb could sense the seed of doubt planted in her voice, in the slight hesitation before she said goodbye. Ending the call, Caleb leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his thoughts clouded. The memories returned unbidden, unrelenting. He saw Evelyn on their wedding day, radiant and full of hope. He saw her curled up on the couch, a book in her hand, laughing at one of his jokes. And he saw her walking away from him, her shoulders straight but her steps heavy. Now he saw her again, carrying new life within her, her face marked by the weariness of someone who had been through too much. The questions in his mind grew louder, more insistent. He couldn't ignore them anymore, couldn't push them aside like he had. So many other things. For the first time in years, Caleb felt an undeniable pull toward the past. In the days following that dinner at the Elmwood Grill, Caleb was trapped in a loop of relentless thoughts. He replayed every detail, every expression on Evelyn's face. Her composure, the fleeting emotion, perhaps sadness, that had crossed her features when their eyes met. But the thing that haunted him most was the fact that she was pregnant. The questions echoed in his mind, a constant hum he couldn't silence no matter how hard he tried. At work, Caleb struggled to concentrate. Meetings blurred into background noise, and even the congratulations over the success of his latest product launch felt hollow. His assistant, Chloe, noticed his distraction but said nothing, maintaining her usual professionalism. Caleb was quietly grateful for her tact, even though he knew he wasn't fooling anyone. By the weekend, the weight of his thoughts had become unbearable. He needed answers. Caleb began with a simple call to Madison, an old mutual friend who had kept in touch with Evelyn after the divorce. It had been years since they last spoke, the calls becoming sparse as time passed and their lives diverged. When Caleb called, Madison didn't sound surprised. "I was wondering when you'd reach out," she said, her tone a mix of humor and caution. Caleb hesitated. "Did she mention running into me?" "No," Madison said slowly, "but I know she's working at the Elmwood Grill. So you've seen her?" "I have," Caleb admitted, pausing before lowering his voice. "She's pregnant. Is she okay?" There was a brief silence on the other end, and Caleb imagined Madison carefully choosing her words. "She's okay," Madison said at last, her voice softer now, "but it hasn't been easy for her. Evelyn left her old job a while ago to start her own interior design business. Things went well at first, but you know how unpredictable that industry can be. Eventually, she had to take the job at the Elmwood Grill to make ends meet." Caleb felt a pang in his chest. Evelyn had always been ambitious, but her ambitions had been different from his. While he had chased financial success and recognition, she had sought fulfillment and creativity. Hearing that she had struggled filled him with an ache he couldn't ignore, a reminder of all they had once shared, the promises, the dreams, now relegated to the past. "And the baby?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The baby is hers," Madison replied softly. "The father isn't in the picture. She plans to raise the child on her own." Madison's words hit Caleb harder than he expected. He struggled to picture Evelyn navigating pregnancy alone, working long hours while juggling everything else. The thought of it tightened his chest. "She never reached out," Caleb murmured, almost to himself. "She wouldn't," Madison said. "Evelyn isn't the type to ask for help, especially not from you. She's proud, Caleb. And after everything that happened between you two, she's moved on. Or at least she's trying to." The conversation ended soon after, but Madison's words echoed in Caleb's mind. He couldn't shake the guilt that clung to him, the guilt over how their marriage had ended, the choices he had made, and now, the life Evelyn was facing without him. At home, Caleb tried to bury himself in work, but his focus continually slipped. At first, Olivia was patient, assuming he was under pressure following the product launch. But during dinner at the penthouse, her patience finally ran out. "You're not even listening to me," Olivia said, setting her wine glass down with a sharp clink. "I've been talking about our trip for the past 15 minutes, and you haven't said a word." Caleb looked up, startled. "I'm sorry. My mind's elsewhere." "Yes, I can tell," Olivia said, her voice cool. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. This is about her, isn't it? The waitress, Evelyn. Caleb stiffened. Olivia, it's not what you think. Oh, it's not, she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. Because ever since that night, you haven't been yourself. You've been distant, distracted. I'm not stupid, Caleb. I can tell when something or someone is occupying your mind. Caleb ran a hand over his face, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. It's complicated. That's not an answer, Olivia shot back, her voice sharp. Do you still love her? The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Caleb didn't know how to respond. Did he still love Evelyn? He wasn't sure if love was the right word, but the feelings stirred up by seeing her again were undeniable. I don't know, he finally said, his voice barely audible. Olivia laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the tense silence. At least you're honest, she said, rising from her seat and grabbing her purse. You need to figure out what you want, Caleb. And until you do, don't call me. She walked out of the penthouse, leaving Caleb alone. In the heavy silence, he stared at the door for a long time, the echo of her words replaying in his mind. He should have felt angry, or at least defensive, but all he felt was exhaustion. Olivia wasn't wrong. He didn't need to figure out what he wanted. The problem was, he wasn't sure he could. The next day, Caleb found himself scrolling through his phone, looking at photos from the early days of his relationship with Evelyn. There was one from their first trip together, her smile radiant and carefree as she stood on a windswept cliff. Another from a New Year's party, her cheeks flushed from the cold as she laughed at something out of frame. Each photo brought a wave of memories, both beautiful and painful. Caleb couldn't stop wondering how things had gone so wrong. He thought about Madison's words, about Evelyn's pride and determination to handle things on her own. It was something he had always admired about her, but now it felt like an insurmountable wall. He wanted to help her, to be there for her in some way, but he wasn't sure she would let him. The rest of the week passed in a haze, Caleb caught in the limbo between the life he had built and the life he had left behind. Questions about Evelyn, the baby, and his own emotions lingered, unanswered, consuming his thoughts. By Sunday evening, Caleb made a decision. He couldn't keep living in this limbo, trapped between the past and the present. If he wanted answers, closure, or perhaps something more, he needed to talk to Evelyn directly. No more speculations, no more secondhand information. Just the truth, whatever it might be. The next morning, sitting in his office, Caleb picked up his phone and stared at the screen for a long time. Finally, he took a deep breath and dialed the number for the Elmwood Grill. Good afternoon. How may I assist you? The receptionist's polite voice came through. I'd like to speak with Evelyn Hayes, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the knot of unease twisting in his stomach. There was a slight pause on the other end. I'm sorry, but we generally don't disturb our staff during their shifts. May I take a message? Caleb hesitated, then said, Please tell her that Caleb Anderson called. I'd like to meet with her. The receptionist promised to pass along the message, and as Caleb hung up, he felt a glimmer of hope. Fragile, tentative, but hope nonetheless. For the first time in years, he was ready to follow it. The soft hum of the city filled the air as Caleb stepped out of the car in front of the Elmwood Grill. The tailored suit he wore shifted slightly in the cool evening breeze. The restaurant looked the same as it had before, with its glowing lights and familiar sign gleaming in the night. This time, he was alone. The excuse for his return was flimsy at best, a fabricated business meeting he'd mentioned offhandedly to Chloe. But the truth was, there was no meeting. He simply couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see Evelyn again. Inside, the atmosphere was just as he remembered, elegant, alive with the soft murmur of conversation and the gentle clinking of cutlery. He spotted her almost immediately, moving deftly between tables with practiced professionalism. Her black blouse and apron blended into the subdued light, reflecting off polished wood and crisp white linens. Caleb chose a small table in the corner, deliberately opting for a seat out of the way. When Evelyn finally approached, her expression shifted from neutral professionalism to something more guarded. She slowed as she reached his table. Caleb, she said, her voice calm and carefully measured. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. He gestured to the empty chair across from him, then looked back at her. I was hoping we could talk. Her lips pressed into a thin line, clearly hesitant. I'm working. I know, he said quickly, lowering his voice. Just a few minutes. Please. Evelyn's eyes flicked around the room, scanning for a manager or a colleague who might intervene. She let out a small sigh and set her tray down at the edge of the table. Fine, but make it quick. Caleb motioned again to the seat across from him, but Evelyn shook her head. I can't sit down. What do you want? Leaning forward slightly, Caleb spoke softly, his tone earnest. I want to know how you're doing, after everything. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need to know. Evelyn crossed her arms, her stance rigid. Why now, Caleb? It's been years. You moved on, and so did I. I saw you, Evelyn, he said, his voice low but insistent. That night. You're pregnant, working here, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I need to understand. For a brief moment, something softened in her eyes before she regained her composure, the mask of professionalism sliding back into place. I'm fine. I don't need your pity. It's not pity, he said firmly. It's concern. I'm not trying to make this harder for you, I promise. But you looked so tired, so stressed. If there's anything I can do to help, she cut in, her tone sharp with a trace of bitterness. Caleb, I don't need you swooping in to save me. I've managed just fine without you. I know, he said gently, but you don't have to do it all alone. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the kitchen, her body taut as though she was debating walking away. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. Fine. 15 minutes. Meet me out back when my shift ends. Caleb nodded, a wave of relief tightening his chest. He watched her walk away, her posture upright and resolute, though her steps were brisk as if eager to put as much distance between them as possible. He wondered if he had pushed too far. The alley behind the restaurant was quieter than Caleb had expected, the city's hum fading into a faint backdrop. Evelyn appeared a few minutes later, her apron gone, her hair loose and cascading naturally over her shoulders. In the dim glow of the streetlights, she looked different, less guarded, more like herself. For a fleeting moment, Caleb felt transported to a time when seeing her like this was an everyday occurrence. She leaned against the brick wall, arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on him. Talk. Caleb hesitated, searching for the right words. Madison told me about your interior design work. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She also said it hasn't been easy, he continued, his voice softening, and that you've been doing it all on your own. I can't imagine how hard that must be. It hasn't been easy, she admitted after a pause, her tone quieter now. But it's my work. After the divorce, I needed something that was mine. So I left the corporate world and started taking on small projects. Word of mouth helped, and for a while, things were good. But then the market shifted, and clients became scarce. Her gaze dropped, her fingers brushing her stomach in an unconscious gesture. When I found out I was pregnant, I had to take the job here to make ends meet. It's not glamorous, but it's enough. Caleb's eyes followed her hand as it rested gently on her stomach. What about the baby's father? Evelyn's lips pressed into a tight line. He's not in the picture. It wasn't a serious relationship, and when I told him, he made it clear he didn't want to be involved. So, it's just me. Her words struck Caleb harder than he expected. Evelyn had always been strong, but the thought of her facing the challenges of single motherhood alone made his chest ache. You shouldn't have to do this by yourself, he said, his voice low and earnest. Evelyn, I know I messed up. I know I let you down, and I can't change that. But if there's anything I can do now, anything, I want to help. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Why, Caleb? Why do you care now? Because I never stopped caring, he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. I just didn't know how to show it. And I don't want to make the same mistakes again. Her eyes softened briefly before she caught herself, the mask of guardedness slipping back into place. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Caleb, Not after everything. You don't have to decide that right now, he said quickly, his tone fervent. But let me help, even just as a friend. I can connect you with people who can help grow your business. Make sure you don't have to rely on this job to get by. No strings attached. Evelyn hesitated, her hand still resting protectively on her stomach. Finally, she gave a small nod. Fine, but only for the baby. Caleb smiled, a genuine smile, one he hadn't felt in years. For the baby. As they stood there, the quiet hum of the city surrounding them, Caleb felt something shift. This wasn't reconciliation, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long while, he felt he was heading in the right direction. Caleb couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Evelyn. Her words lingered in his mind as he sat in his penthouse that evening, the city lights twinkling outside the vast glass windows. The room felt colder than usual, the silence almost stifling. For years, Caleb had measured his worth by the size of his achievements. The deals closed, the markets conquered, the wealth accumulated. But now, sitting amidst all the symbols of his success, he felt an unfamiliar emptiness. Evelyn had always valued what he had overlooked: family, connection, balance. He used to see her priorities as naive, convinced that success required sacrifice. But now, he wasn't so sure. The image of Evelyn standing in that alley, weary but unbroken, played repeatedly in his mind. She was fighting for something greater than herself, for something that truly mattered. And him? What was he fighting for? Another zero in his bank account? Another headline in the business section? For the first time in years, Caleb began to question if he had been chasing the wrong things all along. The next morning, everything felt off. His usual cup of coffee tasted bitter, meetings dragged longer than necessary, and even the board's congratulations on the success of the latest product failed to bring him any satisfaction. Chloe, his assistant, noticed. "Are you all right, Mr. Anderson?" she asked cautiously, placing a folder on his desk. "You've seemed a bit distracted lately." Caleb looked up, surprised by her observation. "I'm fine, Chloe. Just a lot on my mind." She hesitated before nodding and leaving the room, though her expression made it clear she didn't believe him. Caleb couldn't blame her. He didn't believe himself either. That evening, Olivia arrived unannounced at his penthouse, the sharp click of her heels echoing off the marble floors as she walked in. She was as impeccably dressed as ever, her makeup flawless, her smile radiant, but her tone carried a frosty edge as she greeted him. "I've given you space," she began, her voice calm but calculated. "But I think it's time we talked." Caleb set his whiskey glass down on the table, bracing himself. "About what?" "About whatever's been going on with you," Olivia said, seating herself elegantly on the sofa across from him. "You've been distant, distracted, and I think I know why." He stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "It's about Evelyn, isn't it?" she said, narrowing her eyes. "You've been different since that night at the restaurant. Don't deny it." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair, the weight of the conversation pressing on him. "I'm not denying it. I saw her, and it stirred up a lot. She's going through a tough time, and I want to help." Olivia laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "Help? Caleb, she's your ex-wife. Whatever she's dealing with isn't your responsibility anymore. You're with me now." "I know," he replied, his tone calm but firm, "but I can't just ignore it. She's someone I once cared about. A part of me still does." Olivia's expression darkened, the polished veneer cracking momentarily before she quickly composed herself. "So, what's your plan? Play the hero? Throw money at her and feel noble?" "It's not about money," Caleb said, rising to his feet, emotions surging within him. "It's about doing the right thing, something I didn't do enough of when I was with her." Olivia stood too, her heels bringing her nearly eye to eye with him. "And what about us, Caleb? Are you willing to throw everything away just because your ex-wife suddenly reappeared?" Caleb met her gaze, the gravity of the moment sinking in. "I don't think this has been working for a while, Olivia. We've been going through the motions, but there's no real connection. At least not the kind there should be." Olivia's face froze, the mask of composure fully shattering for a fleeting moment before she recovered. I see, she said, her voice icy. So, this is it then? He nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. I think this is what's best for both of us. Olivia grabbed her purse, her movements swift and deliberate. You'll regret this, she said, heading for the door. You always do. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Caleb alone in the expansive, empty space of his penthouse. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing even as a faint pang of guilt lingered. He didn't regret his decision, but that didn't make it any easier. In the weeks that followed, Caleb found himself thinking more about Evelyn than the demands of his company. Quietly, he reached out to a few trusted contacts in the design industry, putting in a good word for her and directing potential clients her way. He also arranged for her to meet with a financial advisor, ensuring her business had the support it needed to grow. Caleb didn't tell Evelyn anything. He understood her pride and knew she wouldn't accept help if she thought it was charity. Instead, he allowed opportunities to come her way naturally, hoping she would seize them without suspicion. Their meetings at the restaurant became more frequent, though still brief. Evelyn remained gentle but cautious, her defenses firmly intact. Caleb respected her boundaries, but ensured she knew he was always there if she needed anything. One evening, as they sat in the alley behind the restaurant after Evelyn's shift, she broke the silence. I don't understand why you're doing all this, Caleb, she said, her gaze fixed on him. Helping me? I mean, you don't owe me anything. Caleb looked at her, his expression sincere. I'm not doing it because I owe you. I'm doing it because I care, and because I want to. Evelyn froze for a moment, studying him closely, her eyes searching his face as if to find some hidden motive. Finally, she nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking across her lips. Thank you. Caleb felt warmth spread through his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about helping Evelyn. It was about rebuilding. Something he had lost long ago. Trust, connection, purpose. As weeks passed, Evelyn's business began to flourish. She still worked part-time at the restaurant, but her focus had returned to her passion, and Caleb could see the difference it made. Evelyn seemed lighter, happier, even as her pregnancy became more pronounced. Caleb didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Helping Evelyn wasn't just about atoning for the past. It was about building something better, something real. Caleb stepped into Evelyn's new studio, the scent of fresh paint and polished wood greeting him as he crossed the threshold. The space was vibrant and alive with color. Fabric swatches draped over chairs, mood boards pinned to the walls, and small potted plants placed neatly in every corner. The studio was small but full of character, just like Evelyn. Hey, she greeted, looking up from her desk where she was organizing tile samples. Her smile was cautious but genuine, a stark contrast to the guarded expression she had worn when they first reconnected. What brings you here? I was nearby, Caleb said, keeping his tone casual, though he had intentionally stopped by to check in. Wanted to see how things were going. She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Busy, which is a good problem to have. She smiled faintly. The clients you mentioned reached out, and they've been keeping me on my toes. Caleb settled into a chair, his gaze sweeping across the room. It's great to see this place coming together. I knew you could do it. Evelyn tilted her head, her smile tinged with skepticism. I'm still figuring things out. It's not always smooth, but it's mine, and that makes it worth it. Caleb admired her quiet determination, the same strength that had always been her greatest asset. If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask. I mean it. I know, she said softly, her eyes meeting his, and I really appreciate it. One evening, after closing the studio, they took a walk through a nearby park. The atmosphere was easy, the silence between them comfortable. Eventually, Caleb broke the quiet. I've been thinking a lot about the past, he said, his voice gentle but tinged with regret. Evelyn glanced at him, curiosity mingling with caution. About what? About us. About the ways I hurt you, he admitted. I was so focused on my career that I lost sight of what really mattered. I took you for granted, and I'm so sorry. She slowed her pace, her gaze resting on the path ahead. You don't have to apologize, Caleb. We both made mistakes. I know, he said, stopping and turning to face her, but I should have listened to you more. You wanted something real, something I couldn't see at the time. And now I realize how much I missed because I was too stubborn to appreciate what we had. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes searching his face. People change, she said finally, her tone contemplative. And I think you've changed too. Her simple yet weighty words struck Caleb deeply. He nodded slightly, a small smile forming on his lips. I'm trying. And I want you to know, no matter what happens, I'll be here, for you and for the baby. Evelyn's lips curved into a softer smile this time. Thank you, Caleb. That really means a lot. They continued walking, their conversation shifting to lighter topics, but the moment lingered between them. It was a small but significant step forward. Inspired by Evelyn's passion for supporting local artisans and small businesses, Caleb began exploring ways to use his influence to make a difference. He reached out to his contacts in the city, proposing initiatives to uplift startups. His company launched a sponsorship program for young designers and organized community events to celebrate local talent. Evelyn was hesitant at first when he mentioned these projects, worried about becoming the focus of his efforts. This isn't just about me, is it? She asked one evening as they sat in her studio, reviewing a proposal he had drafted. It's inspired by you, he clarified, but it's not just about you. This community has so much potential, and I want to nurture that. You reminded me that investing in people, not just profits, is what really matters. She studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. That's wonderful, Caleb. I'm proud of you. Her words touched Caleb more deeply than he expected, bringing a warmth he hadn't realized he had missed. Thank you, he said simply. Over time, Evelyn's trust in Caleb grew, and a new friendship began to take shape between them. It wasn't the all-consuming, overwhelming connection of their early years, but something steadier, built on mutual respect and understanding. Caleb cherished it, knowing it was fragile and vowing not to squander it. One afternoon, as they worked together in her studio, Caleb moving furniture while Evelyn arranged a new display, she paused and looked at him. You really have changed, she said, her tone a mix of surprise and admiration. Caleb set down the chair he was carrying and dusted off his hands. I had to. Losing you was the wake-up call I didn't realize I needed. Evelyn smiled, warmth shining in her eyes in a way Caleb hadn't seen before. Maybe something good came out of it after all. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. It wasn't a declaration or a promise, but it was something, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had been through and the possibilities that lay ahead. One ordinary afternoon, Caleb's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen, expecting a message from his assistant or a client, but instead, it was a call from an unknown number. Something about it made his chest tighten. Hello? He answered, his voice cautious. Caleb, it's Madison. Her voice came through, urgent. Evelyn's been taken to the hospital. She's gone into early labor, and she's asking for you. Caleb's breath caught. Is she okay? What happened? She's stable, but the doctors are monitoring her closely. The baby's coming early, and she's scared. She didn't know who else to call. Caleb was already on his feet, grabbing his keys as he bolted toward the door. Which hospital? Madison gave him the address, and he didn't waste another second. He thought about calling his driver but couldn't wait, deciding to drive himself. The city blurred past him as he sped through, his thoughts consumed entirely by Evelyn. As Caleb arrived at the hospital, the sharp scent of antiseptic and the low hum of controlled chaos immediately enveloped him. He approached the reception desk, his heart pounding in his chest. Evelyn Hayes, he said, his voice taut with urgency. Where is she? The nurse directed him to the maternity ward, and he hurried down the stark white corridor, the sound of his footsteps echoing sharply against the walls. Stopping outside her room, he took a moment to steady himself before stepping inside. Evelyn lay on the hospital bed, her face pale and glistening with sweat. Her hair clung to her forehead in damp strands, but her eyes, though filled with fear, held a fierce determination. When she saw him, A flicker of relief crossed her face. "You're here," she said, her voice weak but resolute. "Of course," he replied, quickly moving to her side. "I'm here." She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly as another contraction racked her body. Caleb felt a wave of helplessness wash over him as he watched her battle through the pain, her entire frame trembling with the effort. "The baby's early," she said, her voice quivering as the contraction ebbed. "They said it's not ideal, but we'll be okay, right?" "You'll be okay," Caleb assured her, his voice steady. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Evelyn. You're going to get through this." A faint smile touched her lips, though her grip on his hand didn't loosen. For the first time, Caleb saw a vulnerability in her that struck something deep within him. Evelyn wasn't just the woman he had once loved. She was a fighter, a survivor, and now, a mother on the brink of bringing new life into the world. Time passed slowly, each contraction bringing Evelyn closer to delivery. Caleb stayed by her side through it all, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, and silently marveling at her strength. Nurses and doctors came and went, adjusting equipment and providing updates, but Caleb barely noticed them. His entire world was centered on the woman in the hospital bed and the new life they were about to meet. When the final moments arrived, the room was filled with a flurry of purposeful motion. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, their actions precise and efficient. Caleb stood beside Evelyn, gripping her hand tightly as she pushed through the pain, her cries piercing the sterile air of the room. "You're doing amazing," he said, his voice firm despite the whirlwind around them. "I'm right here, Evelyn." Evelyn didn't let go of his hand, her grip so strong it sent a dull ache up his arm. Caleb welcomed the pain, a small price to share in the burden she bore. Watching her fight for the baby, her baby, awakened a profound shift within him. The baby's first cry pierced the air, freezing time for a heartbeat. The doctor held up the tiny, wriggling body and announced, "It's a boy." Evelyn collapsed back onto the bed, her face etched with exhaustion and relief. Caleb looked at her, his heart swelling with pride and something even deeper. When the nurse placed the baby in Evelyn's arms, tears streamed down her face as she gazed at her son for the first time. "He's perfect," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Caleb leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the baby cradled in her arms. The tiny face scrunched up, the cries softening into faint whimpers as Evelyn held him close. "He is," Caleb agreed, his voice hoarse with emotion. They sat there, the chaos of the delivery room fading into the background as they shared the moment. When the nurse took the baby to clean and swaddle him, Caleb pulled a chair closer to Evelyn's bedside, his hand gently covering hers. "You were incredible," he said softly. "I've never seen anything like that." Evelyn let out a tired laugh, her eyes drifting closed for a moment. "I don't think I could have done it without you." Her words hung in the air, filling Caleb with gratitude and a quiet yearning. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Evelyn," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to say." She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Seeing you like this, witnessing you bring a new life into this world, it made me realize what I've missed. You're incredible, Evelyn. You always have been. And I think I've always loved you." Evelyn's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly in surprise. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," he continued, his voice catching with emotion. "But I need you to know that I'm here for you, for the baby, for anything you need. I'll be whatever you want me to be, a friend, a co-parent, whatever you decide." Evelyn looked at him, her expression unreadable. Caleb feared he had said too much, that he had pushed her further away. But then, her hand tightened around his, and a faint smile crossed her lips. "Caleb," she said softly, "you've changed. I can see that. And I think we can figure this out together." Relief and hope surged through him, his chest tightening under the weight of her words. He nodded, unable to speak, simply holding her hand and sitting by her side in silence. When the nurse returned with the baby and carefully placed him back in Evelyn's arms, Caleb leaned closer, his eyes fixated on the tiny face that symbolized a new beginning, a second chance for all of them. The weeks that followed were filled with sleepless nights and peaceful moments full of new life. Caleb visited Evelyn and the baby, James, almost every day. He marveled at how a tiny boy had quickly become the center of their world and how James's presence seemed to heal the cracks in their past. Evelyn gradually softened. Her initial caution toward Caleb gave way to something gentler, more trusting. They had difficult conversations since that night in the hospital, conversations that forced them to confront their past mistakes. But with each exchange, Caleb saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a willingness to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, Caleb sat on Evelyn's couch, holding James in his arms. The baby had just drifted off to sleep, his tiny hand curled around Caleb's finger, and the sight made Caleb's heart swell. This story serves as a reminder that it's never too late to change, to mend what's broken, and to prioritize love and family above all else. Have you ever found strength through forgiveness, or given yourself, or someone else a second chance? Share your story in the comments. It might inspire and bring hope to someone in need. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and share to spread the message of love, resilience, and hope. Thank you for following along and supporting these meaningful stories. Stay tuned for more. These stories are gathered from various sources and do not represent any specific individual or organization. They are shared to promote the human values we cherish and have been rewritten with AI assistance. If any errors occur, please accept them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.